and the children of Israel are in slavery and they need to escape. How do they escape? By the death of an animal. A lamb has to be slain. And we think of the temple in Jerusalem and these sacrifices as kind of clean and sanitary, but there was one time in Jerusalem where they killed over 250,000 Passover lambs at one Passover. Can you imagine killing 250? That's 250,000 lambs. They cut their throats. They hang them by the back legs over the altar until all the blood drips out onto the altar. And at this time, there were so many lambs killed, they had to have a bucket brigade. They had to kill them out into the courtyards, put their blood in buckets, and pass it up to the altar to dump on the altar. It was like a slaughterhouse in Jerusalem. You ever smelled blood? When I did our Moses movie, I went to a slaughterhouse to get real blood, and it was nasty. It smelled bad and coagulated. I won't even go into any more of that. But it's the Passover lamb. Moses had to kill the Passover lamb, each family, and then they had to pass through water, and above was a spirit, water and spirit, by the way, being born again through water baptism, and they ate the special bread out in the wilderness. But the Passover lamb had to die, and Jesus is our Passover lamb, and that's going to be more important for us as we go along in this. And then another image of the Eucharist in the Old Testament is the manna. Out in the wilderness of Sinai, the manna fell from the sky. They were hungry, and I don't blame them. Say that we read this Old Testament passages about how they grumbled and complained. I'd have been the first one in the line to grumble and complain against Moses. Have you ever been through Sinai and through those areas of Jordan? It is miserable. Sandstorms blow, and we see snow in 3-foot drifts here. They said sand in 3-foot drifts there. And they're going for days without water, days without food. And then all of a sudden, God gives them a great miracle. The manna comes down from the heaven, and they walk out and they look at it, and they have no idea what happened, what it was. Do you know what the word manna means? When they walked out of their tents in the morning and looked out and saw these flakes on the ground, they said, "What is it?" And in Hebrew, manna means, "What is it?" Manna means, "What is it?" So that's the Hebrew word. So really, they walked out and they saw the "what is it?" on the ground. That applies in a little bit later when the Jews walked away from Jesus, when he explained that you must eat me, the meat, the bread that's come down from heaven. And they walk away because they said, "What is it? What are you talking about?" And they walked away. But that's the manna. The manna is the bread of life come down from heaven. Jesus said in John chapter 6, if you eat your Moses and the fathers, they ate the bread which came down and they still died. But if you eat the bread of life, me, you will never die. And then in Micah, that brings us right to Micah, since we're talking about bread. In Micah chapter 5, verse 2, is the prophecy that Bethlehem is going to be the place. O you Bethlehem, O Ephratah, who are little among the clans of Judah, from you shall come forth the one to be the ruler of Israel. What does Bethlehem mean? I have a picture of me hitchhiking to Bethlehem under a sign that says Bethlehem, 2 words. Bethlehem, house of bread. Mary, what's in her womb on the donkey as she's going from Nazareth, that 8 or 10 day journey through the 120-degree temperatures or whatever it was through the Jordan Valley to Bethlehem? What's in her womb when she's riding that donkey with flies buzzing around her head? The bread of life. Mary is going to the house of bread to deliver the bread. And where does she put the bread when she gets there? And when we take our pilgrims into the lower level of the Church of Nativity in Bethlehem, there are 2 little shrines there. One is the place where you reach down and touch the ground where Mary gave birth to Jesus. And then you take a few steps down here, and there's another one where you stop and touch our rosaries and pray. And this is the place where she put Jesus in the manger. In the cave, and it's still a cave today with a church built over it. Why did Mary put Jesus in the manger? What is a manger? A manger is a food dish for sheep. We're the sheep of God. From the very beginning, Mary is telling us that he is going to become our food. She puts him in a dish where the sheep come to eat. From the very beginning, we learn that he's going to be our food, placed in the dish for the sheep. And this is in Bethlehem, the house of bread. We're already being told, even in that verse, the best way to study the Bible. People say to me, "Steve, how do you study the Bible?" I say, ask as many dumb questions as you can, and then find answers. Why Bethlehem? Why? Because it's the house of bread. And this is where the bread is going to be born. This is how the fathers thought about the Scriptures. This is how the Jews worked with the passages. It's so exciting to study the Bible. There's nothing else quite like it. But anyway, we're going to move on. One more I'm going to tell you about in Malachi 1:11, where Malachi prophesies, and he said, from the setting of the sun, from the rising of the sun to its setting, my name will be great among the nations, and in every place incense offered to my name, a pure offering, will be made among the nations. Another translation says, from east to west. The Jews have a problem with a passage like this because the sacrifices were given to them and they were to be performed in the temple in Jerusalem, which God had called the place for the sacrifices is in Jerusalem. And here it says that there is going to be a pure sacrifice, a pure offering offered among the nations. The Gentile goyim dogs, how can they offer a pure sacrifice? They're filthy dogs. They're not a part of the covenant of God. They're uncircumcised. Even today, there's still this attitude with some of the very religious Jews. When we were filming the Paul DVD, I was at the Western Wall. And I was there with my camera, and I was talking as we walked along the Western Wall with all the Jews praying. And I said, Paul loved the temple. Jesus loved the temple. And as soon as the word Jesus came out of my mouth, two Hasidic Jews just started to tremble and shake and came rushing up to me and said, you cannot say that name here. And I said, yes, I can. I have a permit. But they said, no, you can film here, but you cannot say that name. And there was a big argument ensued over whether I could use the name Jesus or not. And one stood in front of me right in my face, and the other one stood right in front of my camera, saying that I couldn't film. He was going to stand right there until I promised not to say that name again. Very incarnational, by the way, when to think about that. If I'd have been back in the first century, I'd have been taken out and stoned for the name. The only way I could get, by the way, the rabbis came, the police came, it was a big argument. The only way I could finally get him to get away from my camera was I said to him, okay, I am a Gentile, you are a Jew. If you don't get away from my camera, I'm going to touch you. I'm a goyim dog, I'm unclean. He would have to go through ceremonial cleansings before Shabbat, the Sabbath. How could the Gentiles offer a pure sacrifice to God from east to west on an altar, no less? It's a problem. But you go through the fathers of the church and you'll find that one right after another, when they start even from the 2nd century explaining what happens on the altar, they use this verse. This is the Eucharist prophesied by Micah the prophet 500 years before the time of Christ. I want to go to the New Testament. We could do a whole hour just on the New Testament, but I'm just going to touch on 2 points. Jesus says, this is my body, in the upper room, in Jerusalem on Mount Zion. 3 sacraments were instituted in this room: the priesthood, the Eucharist, and confession. It's also where the Holy Spirit came down on the day of Pentecost. If you don't get goosebumps when you walk into that room, I still do after 55 times. But here, Jesus, when he is celebrating the Passover meal with the bread and the wine, the matzah bread and the wine and everything he says, he holds up a piece of that bread and he says, this is my body. Now, when I looked at that with my Baptist glasses, there was an extra word added in there. It says, this represents my body. When I took it off and read it, it said, this is my body. This represents my body. I was looking through a lens of tradition. I didn't go to the Bible alone and let it speak for itself. Bible says what it means and it means what it says. Except here. I was looking through my Baptist tradition and letting my Baptist tradition interpret the Scriptures for me. It doesn't say this represents my body. Jesus said, this is my body. And St. Augustine, early church, says when Jesus spoke those words, he held his own flesh in his own hands. I like to ask people like me back 15 years ago, Steve, back in your old life, wouldn't you have thought it would be smart to maybe go up and talk to Jesus at that point and say, Jesus, you know, we really ought to reword that, what you just said. You know, there's going to be a billion Catholics someday that think you really meant what you just said. Maybe we should reword that, Lord. How arrogant is that? Jesus said what he said.